And then next, we are happy to have Dr. Lily Taylor to present on the topic, The Windows Picture Book, Mathematics and English Teachers' STEAM Approach to Sustainable Development in an Australian Secondary School. Please welcome Dr. Taylor.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me at the back? Excellent, good, because I will try to perhaps come around here if I can. Is that working? Yeah, okay, excellent. Even better, thank you. Okay, so as I've just been introduced, my name is Lily Taylor and I'm from Edith Cowan University in Perth. My other co-presenters are Peter Taylor from Murdoch University, and you may have seen him yesterday. He did the keynote address on STEAM education, and he provided you with a theoretical background of what I'm going to talk to you about is a practical example of what he was talking about yesterday. The other two people who are listed as co-presenters, Ray Williams and Tim Manier, are school teachers, secondary teachers in a community college where Ray Williams is the head of mathematics and Tim Manier is the head of English. Now you may think, how come a maths and an English teacher work together on a STEAM project? Well, let's explore that, shall we? Through the example of a picture book by Jeannie Baker that was called The Window. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of background what the situation in Western Australia is. This is a map of Western Australia, and the little dots are settlements of about 1,000 people. So you can imagine most of this huge part of Australia is actually uninhabited and also uninhabitable because there's just no water. So you can imagine where you see the dots is where we basically have water and where people can live. And as you can see here, most of the inhabited areas are around the area of the capital of Western Australia in the southwest, which is called Perth. Most of the settlements are in what we call the coastal plain, which is basically a sand plain that is between a hilly area of granites, the continental shelf, and then we've got the Indian Ocean over here. So the coastal plain is characterized by, so this is Perth, which is, as you can imagine, like any other big city in the world, and it is sprawling, it is spreading at a rapid pace. The coastal area itself doesn't look like much. However, it contains some of the most rare and vulnerable communities of plants and animals on this earth, and they only exist in this particular area. So what we have here, for example, is what we call the cowslip orchid, very rare. We've got smoke bushes here. They make up a large part of the vegetation. And up there we've got one of the flowering shrubs or bushes, which is called a banksia. Very common in this coastal plain. Don't exist anywhere else other than in this particular area. So what are these areas now confronted with? This. The more the city spreads, the more suburbs spring up in the coastal plain. And we have a huge issue with urbanization. So Perth is now, it has grown to such a degree that it spreads over about 100 kilometers and about 70 kilometers in width. So just imagine. Most of the houses are actually individual houses. So for people living in Hong Kong, where you live in a very densely populated area, if you think about it, since Perth builds about 13 to 15,000 new houses and 1,500 units each year. So we clearly have a problem with sustainable development. So what we have in Western Australia is, on the one hand, we have a wish to conserve the natural environment. On the other, we have a need to provide housing for a lot of new people moving to Western Australia. So what we really have here is what we call an ethical dilemma. Now, what is an ethical dilemma? An ethical dilemma is a situation in which you have to make a decision which has consequences. Consequences for other people, consequences for animals, consequences for plants, consequences for the environment. There is no simple solution in an ethical dilemma because otherwise it wouldn't be a dilemma. So we have to go backwards and forwards in our thinking. And it creates, according to Piaget, it creates a cognitive dilemma. It makes us feel uncomfortable. And it requires us to draw on our values. And this is where the use of ethical dilemmas comes in as part of STEAM education, where we are trying to encourage students to take action, to become moral agents through engaging with ethical dilemmas. So an ethical dilemma story then, that principle goes back to Lawrence Kohlberg. These are stories that contain one or more ethical dilemma situations in which we require our students to make ethical decisions on a particular problem. Like in this case, the ethical dilemma would clearly be, we need houses, but we also want to protect the environment. So it's an effective way of engaging students in real-life problem-solving situations. So Ray Williams and Tim Manier, they're English and a maths teacher, and they basically thought, we want to do something about sustainable development, but how can an English and a maths teacher do something in the sustainability field? So after a long, going backwards and forwards, they decided to go with a picture book. And they worked with Year 9 and Year 10 secondary students. Now, how could they do this? They decided, so this is basically about the picture book. This particular book, The Window, has on every page, it starts off with a mother and a baby looking out of a window. And as you can see, there's a natural environment, lots of trees, lots of plants. When you look very carefully, you actually see birds and other animals in there as well. And then over the course of 20 years, every year or every 2 years, there's a snapshot through that same window. And you can see how the environment changes. From a perfect natural environment to this very urbanized environment. So in the last image of the book, you see the man, the boy, is now a man holding his own baby, looking out at basically a city like New York. Now, of course, the author is exaggerating, right? Cities don't grow that fast, but she's making a point here. She's making a point that our cities are growing too fast and they are consuming too many resources and too much of the natural environment. So Ray Williams and Tim Manier decided to use this picture book as their starting approach, as their ethical dilemma story to engage the students. So how did they do it? From a mathematical point of view, they went through the picture book and tried to figure out where's the mathematics in this picture book. And initially they thought, well, there can't be much, but then they found a lot. They started off with counting individual species, birds, for example, or particular trees. Then they started graphing over time. And what they noticed was that initially there were lots of birds. And in the end, there were lots of cats and no birds. So that was quite telling. And they could show that. They could show that in tables. They could show it in graphs. Furthermore, they found And some of you may be familiar with the so-called Fibonacci sequence or the golden ratio in mathematics. And they found that this golden ratio was basically implemented in every image. A perfect image follows the principles of the golden ratio. We can find the golden ratio also, for example, in snail shells. We find it everywhere in nature. So this is mathematics applied in nature. And the students found it in the picture book, so that was quite amazing. So where did an English teacher and a maths teacher find common ground? Because that's where they had to start off with. So the two of them sat together and they started looking at the curriculum. And they started mapping the maths curriculum versus the English curriculum. And they started drawing on other areas like the arts and science and brought in the contents they needed to create this project. What they found was that certain terms were used in both learning areas. For example, we can use the term scale in mathematics, and we can use it as an English word describing a scale, can't we? We can talk about perspectives from a mathematical point of view. We can talk about perspective in the language point of view, taking on a particular perspective. You can talk about growth in mathematical terms. You can talk about it in terms of what does growth actually mean. And one particular one that stood out was the term hyperbole, because hyperbole is an exaggerated expression in English, in the English language, or in any other language probably, where someone makes a statement where everyone knows this can't be true, but to make a point. Like, for example, the whole world was staring at me. Can't be, can it? Or you could have knocked me over with a feather. So this is hyperbole in the language area. Hyperbole in mathematics, this is what it looks like there. So the two of them found increasingly common ground where initially they thought there isn't much that connects English and maths. They found a lot to talk about. So what difficulties did they experience whilst they were doing the project? They insisted on teaching together. So where an English teacher was in a maths teacher's room and the maths teacher was in the English teacher's room. Now, of course, that created huge problems for the timetabling people because they found it difficult to coordinate. But they had the support from the school principal and therefore they could go ahead with the project. When they did the curriculum mapping, they realized it's a time-consuming effort. So given that they were both very busy teachers, to carve out the time they needed for the necessary mapping was one of their big issues. And also, there was one difficulty they didn't really expect, which came from some students. Because some students didn't like to have integrated sessions. Like, a STEAM session. They wanted to have a mathematics session because they wanted to be prepared for the next test and to do really well at the next test. And they thought they weren't really learning anything in a STEAM project. So that was something that surprised the teachers. So one issue that a lot of teachers engaging in STEM or STEAM often run into is the issue of assessment. Because teachers often say, well, how do we assess this integrated stuff? Well, these two, they basically created, they got the students to create a project report where they had to report on their mathematical learning, and they had to write a persuasive text, which is a text that is trying to convince someone of an argument for English. They had to do presentations in English. They had to use argumentation and communication skills and demonstrate their learning in the project. These are a few examples, as you can see up here. These are some of the reports the students wrote. this student here was particularly interesting in writing about the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, and he wrote extensively about it in his report. This student up there describes the difference between linear growth and exponential growth, and that what we can see in the picture book described in the urbanization that we see there is quite clearly exponential growth. So this is year 9s, year 10s writing about those topics. So from one of those student reports, they all had to write a personal reflection at the end. And this, to me, is one of the most interesting parts, because this is where you see whether a student has actually personally engaged in a project. So this student wrote, "The window highlights a dilemma to all of us as our population increases. Where do we all want to live? And what price will the environment pay for our wants and needs? This raises the issue of how we can try and reverse the effects of urbanization. We need an exponential increase in greening our community, not houses, greening," I love that, "resulting in a return of wildlife, and life in the community improves for everybody." So this is, we heard ocean optimism today. Now this is basically greening optimism that the kids have. So they didn't just focus on the problem, they focused on the next step. What can we do to overcome this issue? And then they said that one, and this really stuck with me. "A sense of belonging shows that we can live in harmony with nature." And this comes from a year 9 student. And I thought when I read this gives me hope. This gives me hope because, when we can engage students to get to that point where they want to do something and where they can see that we can actually live in harmony with nature, that's a good thing. So, given the time, I would like to say thank you. I hope this is the right sign. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. And now here we are in the Q&A sessions. And I have received a question on, first, thank you so much for Dr. Taylor for sharing such very creative and innovative kind of STEAM education that maybe it is not very commonly used in Hong Kong, and it will be really inspiring. And so we would like to ask that if, because it seems that the picture books are in the issue-based content, so how can we connect this issue-based content into the next step, maybe in the STEAM education? Could it be turning into some more technology or engineering aspects?
Right, okay, I'll try to answer the question. Well, let me start off at the beginning, which is, why did they choose a picture book? Because it's in the curriculum. Okay, so for year 9 English students, they have to do picture books as part of their English curriculum. So it has the issue of sustainable development written throughout the story. And how can we use it for technology? Was that what you were saying?
Yes.
Yeah. How can we use it for technology? Well, yeah, actually the students were using, and you may see this, let me just go back inside, into the okay. So when you look here, these students were actually using graphics calculators for creating and for doing all the counting, the graphing, and so they were using technology all along. This is not something I was particularly talking about, but one of the teachers, the mathematics teachers, he is actually a representative for Texas Instruments graphics calculators in Australia. So he is one of the best people to teach children on using, you know, these high-tech calculators. And yeah, so that was how they used it. You know, I can imagine you can use it in many other contexts.
Yes. Thank you so much for your great presentations. Thank you again for Dr. Taylor.